when Carol and I were thinking of special sessions for this year, Robert immediately came to mind as someone whose work is just so gorgeous and smart and advocacy based and narrative based that it was a no-brainer. And he's been in my mind to do it for a couple of years. And then immediately I thought of Rona Halualani, who is at San Jose State University, who's a friend, a good colleague, came to USF and did decolonizing the syllabus for our department and really helped us in a training session a couple of years ago, which was beautiful. And the editor of the second edition of the Handbook of Critical Intercultural Research alongside Tom Nakayama. And so we are grateful that you're here and great to have you in the community. And hopefully it'll be a recurring thing because you're wonderful. And I'll turn it over to you to fuss on our friend here and colleague.
Thank you so much, Keith. Much love to you as well. I'm thrilled to be here. I'm Dr. Rona Halualani, as Keith said, from San Jose State University. First time I've actually been a part of this wonderful convening. Big fan of all of you and the work that you do and the work that I see myself a part of. I'm thrilled today to be the moderator of this panel for this amazing scholar, activist, teacher, Dr. Robert Gutierrez-Perez, and his book. And I want to kind of position this book in terms of where it is in relation to how I know him. It's Jotería Communication Studies, Narrating Theories of Resistance, an award-winning book from the National Communication Association. Receive the recognition, Dr. Gutierrez-Perez, because it's fantastic. My area is critical intercultural communication, and it's about looking at intercultural communication in relation to issues of power, which typically has historically been erased in our field of intercultural. And I find Dr. Gutierrez-Perez's work to be so exciting and transformative and really leading the path with regard to not just critical intercultural, but critical communication studies, with regard to critical race and ethnic studies. And this book is so important. And so in this session, we'd love for you to interface with Dr. Gutierrez-Perez, ask him questions, and I'm going to help moderate with regard to the chat and make sure that if you have comments or questions that we absolutely get what you need to be said out there. And Dr. Gutierrez-Perez, do you want to start us out with just a few minutes about your book, and then I can open it up?
Sure. Yeah, that sounds great. Well, first and foremost, I should mention that Rona was my first ever intercultural communication professor way back when I believe I was 20.
Oh my gosh, don't say the age. Don't say the age, Robert.
So we've known each other for a good 20 years. I definitely grew up in that department. I still have like dreams where I'm back in HGH going up those stairs. So I just want to make sure I share that, because for me, this is definitely a full circle moment in my career. And I'm just really excited to be here with you, Rona, and thank you, Keith, for arranging this for us. In general, I re-looked over my book this morning, and I'm just caught by, like, you ever have a feeling when you read something that you wrote, you're like, I wrote this? And not because I feel so disconnected from it, but more because it's just like, I really put a lot of myself into this, whether it's, sharing pictures of my family, sharing pictures that I created out of the research process. Each chapter really sort of discloses and is very vulnerable. When I read it, I always have this feeling of like, is this a poetry book or is this an academic book? And I think it's both. But I wanted to mention before I jump into some of these questions was that for me, writing this book was a matter of survival. I absolutely have been working on ideas around LGBTQ Latinos since I met Rona way back when. And it was really important for me to put all that work into one place. But also, when you start to like do this process with so many different interlocutors, including yourself as an autoethnographer, you start to create an ethnographic sketch of an area of the world. And so it was really important for me to capture what's like to be in the US Southwest at this particular time. And then last but not least, there's very, very few LGBTQ Latinos, who study LGBTQ Latinos. And so I'm just very, very aware that I'm one of a handful of people in the country, even maybe the world at some points, who is talking about this and thinking through this. And so when I was going through graduate school, including my PhD program, I always sort of wish there was a handbook. I mean, I think we all wish there was like a handbook for life. But there was just something about, walking into a room and constantly being the darkest person there, or sometimes being the only queer person there over and over and over, that I just had this impulse that I wanted to create something that could serve as a kind of handbook for those that come after me, to help them navigate this space, but also help them know that they're not alone in how they feel and how they're moving. There's a lot of generative overlaps between myself and other interlocutors going through either comm studies or just academia in general. And I wanted that. And so I'm glad that this won an award. I put a lot of work into this, so it feels good to get that validation. But I'm also hoping that folks really get that piece of the handbook part, that helps people make their lives a little bit more livable. And I would consider this a success. So that's maybe how I'll frame this for now, but I'm just really excited to be here with you, Rona. Excited to be here for everybody. This is my first time at this conference as well, and I'm excited. It's filled with people that I love to read, and cool people in general.
I love that, Dr. Gutierrez-Perez. I'm sorry I'm so formal. I just want to make sure that we pay the fullest recognition. He is a professor also at CSU San Marcos, a really wonderful CSU campus in the Department of Communication Studies. I want to mention that, make sure that is a part of this. And so I ask all of us to open it up, and if you have questions or comments or aspects related to this wonderful book. I love the way you frame it as a handbook. In many ways, it is a handbook of living with regard to identities and whatnot. Please, by all means, you can use your raise your hand feature, or you could put it in the chat. I will make sure that I get that represented. Don't be shy. Anybody? Oh, okay. Yes. Is it Briar? Perfect.
Hi, good morning. It's 6 in the morning, and
Much love, much love.
yeah, I'm still in my dressing gown. I had to come to this workshop. I mean, I haven't read the book. I will, but these are the kind of conversations I really love. And looking at the little paragraph, it says, theories of power and resistance create knowledge. And yes, I've just finished Blueprint for Revolution. So these are the kind of books that I think I would love to read this book. So could you please unpack some of the theories of power and resistance?
Well, absolutely. I think this book is coming from a critical humanist paradigm. I'm very invested in structures of power and how we manifest our identities, our realities through these larger systems of power. However, I'm mostly interested in resistance and agency. And a lot of times folks will call something resistance when I don't know if that's something I would also agree with. I think resistance and agency are some really big ideas, and we have to be very careful about what we're calling resistance and what we're calling agency. So a lot of my investment in structure is so that I can say, okay, there is some, resistive characteristics to this moment of communication that I'm looking at, for example. In terms of other theories that I think are unpacked in this book, there's several. I think one of the main ones that I'm working with is around narrative theory. I'm using what I'm calling borderlands narratives, because when you start to interview LGBTQ Latinos, you start to notice that certain narrative forms are sort of emerge as like the narrative forms in which knowledge is being transferred and produced in those conversations. And so I identified about 6 of them. And so obviously I walk through, what each of these 6 means to me. And then I sort of let the book go. I'm absolutely using those narrative structures as a way to interrogate either the interview or the ethnographic scene or my own autoethnographic analyses. And yet there's other moments where I let the narrative sit on their own and let the reader figure out, okay, oh, he's having a plática with his mom, you know? I might not call it that, but it's absolutely what's happening. So the theories end up being a part of the very narrative structures that I'm using as the writer to convey the information within the book as well. So I'm double layering it here, where it's a mode of analysis, but it's also a mode of presentation. I also am someone who considers myself an Anzalduan scholar. I just love Gloria Anzaldúa. I've fallen in love with her way back when at San Jose State, when I was asked by my professor, Kathleen McConnell, to go to a local conference. And I went to that conference and I had a complete paradigm shift. It was perfect, and it was meant to be. And I just love Gloria Anzaldúa's work. So a lot of the work I'm doing this is putting all the thinking that I put towards some of her major theories, such as Napantla or mestiza consciousness, all in one place. And maybe that's where some of the handbook aspects come in here a little bit. I had to do a lot of work as a young man in communication studies to find all these things, because they're there. They're never just right up front as this is what we're doing. They're sort of on the margins, or if they're cited in the work, then they're cited as sort of like an add-on as opposed to being central to what they're doing. And so a lot of the work I've done in my master's and PhD program were about collecting all this stuff. And so my book, I really wanted all the work that I've done to try to understand this from a communication lens to be in one place, so that no one would have to go and do the same thing that I had to do to get at where I'm at now with this book. I also think that there's one more thing I might want to mention, because I think there's some other theories that are important here, like the path of conocimiento that Gloria Anzaldúa talks about. But I also want to mention that I use a lot of poetic methodologies in this piece. And that's where at the opening of this, I have these feelings sometimes when I'm reading it, like, is this a poetry book or is this an academic book? And I think it's both. And I think it's both. When you're in the individual chapters, there's moments where the data is being presented in a poem. When you're going between the chapters, poetry is being used as an in-between space as one's traveling from one part of the book to another. And I use the metaphor of, I might have said this a couple of times in the book, but my goal is I want to provide lots of different ways for the reader into the book. But once you're in the woods, you got to find your own way out. And so I put a lot of work in there to ask the reader to co-construct the reality of what's being made in that book together.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. Wonderful question. Dr. Berg, I have you down next.
Yep. Hi, I'm Maggie. So you just mentioned this, and I have to apologize. I haven't read the book either. And you talked about the 6 kind of categories you created, or ideas you created for this presentation of queerness. And generally, what I'm assuming, generally they're called Jotería. Yeah. I was wondering if you could briefly just go through the 6 and kind of tell what those mean. I was not a student of Spanish, and so I'm limited in that perspective. And so I would love to hear a little bit about each of these 6.
Absolutely. And so Jotería is a word that has been reclaimed by this community of LGBTQ Latinos. Joto is just a very derogatory word for queer folks in Spanish. There's actually really very few, if no, positive words to be LGBTQ and Latino in the Spanish language. They're all really derogatory and rooted in some really painful colonial histories. And so Jotería is an attempt by this community to sort of reclaim that word. So it can stand for like an identity, a community, or also an area of study. I'll also say that the 6 borderlands narratives that I identify and utilize throughout the book, the first one is cuentos, which translates as sort of like stories, but I'm specifically defining that as cultural stories. There's these moments when you're interviewing folks where they sort of start telling a story, but they're not just telling a story about going to the grocery store. It's embedded in an understanding of what their culture means in terms of their values, beliefs, and norms. And so when I find these moments in the interview, I'm calling them cuentos. I also want to mention that, as many of the folks in the room already know, narrative forms oftentimes overlap. And so I want to make sure that that's something that's clear here, that I divide them into these 6 so I can talk about them and use them as modes of analyses. But in reality, they're oftentimes, when you're in the interview process or you're in the moment of communication, they're blurry. So just to be clear. Another one is chismé, which translates as gossip. Gossip, rumor is a big mode of narrative forms within this community. Oftentimes, the only ways in which this community can fight back is through this mode of narrative. It's also a very painful mode of narrative when it's directed at you. I can't tell you how many times I've been the victim of gossip and rumor for nothing else but, maybe just saying no. Also in these 6 is pláticas, which is chats or talk, but not like chats or talk like, how are you doing? But this is the deep chat. This is deep talk. This is like when grandma would bring out the pan dulce, you have the coffee and you're sitting at the kitchen table and we're going to talk about something. Yeah. So pláticas are sort of the chat or the talk. In many ways, the interviews that I was giving is a form of that plática, right? There's deep chats. There's certain things that LGBTQ Latinos will only talk about with other LGBTQ Latinos. So in the interview process, I was very aware, like, oh, we're only talking about this because it's me doing this. If it was somebody else, we might not be having the same type of chat. Oh, this is a plática. We're getting really deep about something. And the other ones are advice, which is called consejos. Another one is mitos, which is myths or legends. There's a lot of myth making in LGBTQ communities. It's very important if you don't have any symbols that you find empowering, then it's important for folks to create their own symbols. And I think spirituality, spirit, and the soul are wonderful spaces in which people who have nothing can find the power to resist and have agency over their lives and push back on these major systems. I'm thinking, for example, of when Cesar Chavez marched from Delano, California to Sacramento. At the very front of that procession of folks who were just farm workers, Filipino farm workers, Mexican farm workers, was a big, 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 big symbol of the Virgin de Guadalupe. So she was there. They were drawing strength from her to do this long pilgrimage. And so I think it's very fascinating when mitos or myths and legends are deployed in everyday communication interactions. And I think I got 5 for you. Let me think what's the last one here.
Testimonio.
Testimonio, gracias. Yes, testimonio. And it's very different from, testimony, although I think there's some interesting overlaps. Testimonio is usually, the purposeful testimony against a larger system of power. So Rigoberta Menchú is a really good example of the testimonio. This person who is standing, I think with definitely help from an unknown author, to standing on her own 2 feet to give her testimony, to push back on these major systems. And you do see these testimonials pop up in those communication events that I was looking at in this book.
Thank you. Very interesting.
Wonderful. The book itself is already just so wonderful and really engaging. And then just to hear Dr. Gutierrez-Perez talk about it is such a treat, Robert. It's such a treat to hear it, come to life. I digress. Christina, you had a question?
Yeah, first, I just wanted to say thank you to Rona, Keith, Robert. This was a book that fell under my radar, and I have just ordered it because it sounds so fascinating. But something that you just said that I don't know, kind of caught my attention. So you mentioned that there were certain things that LGBTQ Latinos only talk with other LGBTQ Latinos. How was it for you writing about those things? Because I thought about Gloria Anzaldúa and how frustrated as a white lady I was reading it for the first time when so much of it is in Spanish, and having to have that moment that was like, oh, this is not meant for me, right? So how is it to write those identities that are specific to a particular group in a book, knowing that other identities that usually aren't privy to that information, that they'll have access to it?
No.
Like, was that challenging? Did you have to think about what to include, what not to include?
Yeah. I think that's always a process that you undergo when you're dealing with human beings in the research process. As an autoethnographer, I'm always sometimes I really struggle with, like, well, how much do I disclose and how much do I save for myself? Oftentimes as a queer person of color who's an autoethnographer, I think we get asked to go to share a lot more than say some other identities sometimes are asked to share. I make some joke, and I'll be a little crass here for a minute, but I make some jokes sometimes that sometimes like, I already just showed my ass and now you want to see even more. It's like, no, I'm gonna leave it the way I decided to submit it, because there is sort of this I guess cultural something that doesn't allow people of color sometimes to just hold things just for ourselves. But to get to your question, it was a challenge sometimes in some of those interview moments. I'm blessed in that I haven't really experienced as much violence as some of my colleagues or LGBTQ family members out there. And so, holding space for these moments of violence was really challenging. And then, yes, trying to figure out, well, what part of the story should I share? What part of the story should I not share? And I ultimately decided to share as much as I could while holding on to, I think what you're getting at was what I didn't want the person sharing to become a flat character in a story. I wanted this person to sort of come alive. And so in the book itself, I have sort of a chapter where I'm walking through, okay, this is the method that I'm using to gather these oral history interviews. And then, as I'm sort of discussing that, I also start to drop seeds of who these people are. And then I write a stage performance about it, where I don't really talk about, I actually don't share the oral history performances yet. It's just a staged performance where you see these bodies moving. And then the next chapter, that's where all the oral histories are. So there's you almost then your imagination as a reader, I think, has to go through the stage performance with now having the actual oral history interviews, which are in all these various narrative forms, mitos, testimonials, etc. And so it's a slow unfolding. And then I eventually go back and I analyze this as well. So you kind of get sort of 3 shots at these people. And I think that allows it for them to not necessarily flatten out. And they keep coming back. So it asks the reader again to be a little bit more active in the process. And I try to be as clear as possible, but I also recognize that in the writing itself, it's very circular. I have a very circular teaching style as well as a very circular writing style. I'm always coming back to these touch tones and allowing them to sort of layer on each other, boom, boom, boom. And I also, again, because I invite the reader to, find their way into the book, I'm going to help them to get that, but then they have to find their own way out. I actually encourage folks, to start reading at chapter 3 or start reading at chapter 5, because the circular nature of the book is going to get you still the things that you need, but you're kind of picking your own adventure a little bit. And so the things I'm talking about in chapter 1, they are popping up in every other chapter, but they're layering on each other, and you can make your own decision on how you want to experience that knowledge. And specifically to your question, these specific 5 human beings I interviewed and brought on as part of the process of helping folks understand what is Jotería Communication Studies.
Lovely.
Wonderful.
Thank you so much. That sounds so cool. I'm excited to read it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Christina. Keith,
Yeah,
you're up.
I'm loving this conversation. I stepped out of the room for a second, so I might have missed this, and I can't remember it from your book. And the book is so beautifully written, by the way, brilliantly written. It is all of what you're saying and more. I love a good introductory chapter or 2, and I think you do a great job in that. It helped me learn and helped me prepare to move through. Of course, I started more linearly in this moment, but now I want to go back and start in chapter 3. But to that point, and this, non-linear pastiche in a way kind of thing, was it a decision to go with that approach, one, at least in part, because it reflects the everyday lived experience you're trying to create an understanding of, the story you're trying to tell? Does it match the lived experience in the community you're trying to talk us through? Like, does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I think I would say, yes, it was. For me, it was very important to have the poetry there, breaking up the narratives. It was also very important for me to, have everything is connected, because I'm looking at the same community over and over and over from different methodologies. So over time, as you're reading the book, you sort of start to eventually start to see something, because I'm looking at the same thing over and over again. And I think if we're drawing on Gloria Anzaldua's theory of the mestizo consciousness in a serious way, I mean, these are people who internally and externally navigate identities, cultures, and societies that just clash with each other, right? And so even me, I'm half Mexican, a quarter Black, a quarter white, and my whole life I had sort of these conflicting messages, these conflicting codes of how to be a man, or how to be a good citizen. There's all these conflicting messages, and in the process of working that internal struggle out, knowledge is created, a way of being and understanding the world is created. And so I did want the book to reflect that mestiza consciousness, that sort of coming together of lots of different methods, coming together of lots of different perspectives, to sort of build something in this very layered, circular, creation-centered way.
Cool. That's wonderful. That's helpful. Not seeing any other hands, I might ask you another one if we have, yeah. So whenever I'm around thinking about or talking with Dr. Halualani, one of us needs to mention John Warren, which at least personally, on the personal level, is how Rona and I got to know each other. Or started to, before he died in 2011. It's coming up, that anniversary. You know, and you articulate well, and I think folks can fill in as well, like why the book is important, you know, why it's needed, what it was a response to. And John used to ask a question. He used to teach students the way to like enrich the rationale is to not only talk about why something's important, but to do so by asking what's at stake if readers don't take it seriously. What's at stake if readers don't lean in and take it seriously? So I don't know if you had any insights on that for you as the author here.
Yeah, I love that question. And I should also back up and say that I'm a really big fan of John Warren. Back when I was Rona's student, I mean, my big dream was to work with Deanna Fassett at San Jose State and then go to, you know, Carbondale with John and finish up my training there. So when he passed away so suddenly, I really felt that. It was something that had propelled me and got me through, you know, all those long nights and those long readings and et cetera, et cetera. So I want to make sure I mention that. I'm a big fan of John Warren.
And he would have been a yours too, to somebody say. He would have been a yours.
He would have loved this book. I just put that in the chat. He would have absolutely loved it.
Yeah, that makes me feel really good. I just look up to him so much. And I'm also very aware with the book of my academic lineages. So for example, my dissertation advisor is Bernadette Calafell, who worked with Diso Edie Madison, who worked with Dwight Conquergood. And if you look at my works cited list, I'm very attentive to who I'm citing and why. And so you'll see those three in there a lot, but you'll also see John and Rona as well, because I'm a body that is only in this space because of the bodies that have invested their time and energy into my success. I mean, Rona will tell you I was that little kid who lived on campus, who rode his longboard to class. And who put it by the door, and that was my spot, you know? So I've come a long way. But to get to your question, I think there's a couple of things that are at stake with this particular book. I think one is the continued colonization of our field and the ways in which, you know, white supremacy and cis heteronormativity are just the name of the game. I think that there's a lot of students and frankly, a lot of faculty that need a book like this. I'm very happy to hear that the book has made itself onto a lot of students' dissertation and theses list. So I know it's accomplishing that roadmap or that handbooks part of it. But I think the biggest takeaway for me really is this book is interrogating and having an intervention with the very process in which we're generating knowledge. What do we consider knowledge? What is valid? What is not valid? What are we even calling knowledge? Because there's already an answer for that out there in the field. And without this book, that's the only answer that I think you'll get. I think the fact that, again, I'm sitting here, I'm like, is this a poetry book or is this an academic book? And that blurring of genres, which I love as part of Gloria Anzaldua's method as well. She really blurs genres really well. I think I'm doing the very thing I'm asking everyone else to do, which I think not a lot of people do. I think a lot of people get on their stumps and they say, this is the things that we need to do to be more decolonial, and these are the things that we need to do to be anti-racist. But then the actual writing of the document, whether it's the journal article or the monograph, they're going to present that knowledge and information in all the ways in which we've been disciplined to do so. And so I think that's another part of this book, is it's very much demonstrating how to do this work, but also talk about and generate knowledge in a way that I think is incredibly valuable for so many folks out there. I am really hopeful that people will take some of these methods that I've developed and integrated with Anzalduan thought and do some really amazing, powerful things with it. That'd be my greatest dream. And it's nice to see that some of that's starting to pop up. But I think that's the intervention I'm making is, what's knowledge? What are we considering knowledge? And I think those types of questions are really the value of this book.
Gracias.
Wonderful. Thank you, Keith, for that. And thank you for the links. There are links, everybody, in the chat to Dr. Warren and Dr. Fassett's book. And I'll repost the link to Rob's book as well. Tony, you had a question?
Yes, it's such a treat sharing the space with you. So thank you, Robert and Rona and Keith and everybody here who's here. So just a question on technique or craft, and I'm thinking of the folks in this room. There are a few. I know there are some new autoethnographers in here, and I want to ask this, some kind of technique question. The easy way I want to put that is, how do you get through what are your techniques to getting into these very difficult topics? You talk about survival. What are the things that you actually do, and how do you get there? And maybe this advice on, the broadly advice folks wanting to challenge what passes as knowledge. Absolutely. So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I have a couple of different methods that I use to jump into these topics. Some of you in the room know, I spent several years writing about the massacre at Pulse Orlando. That was one of the most difficult projects I've had, where you just get to the computer screen and you just start crying. You go get to a little bit more data to answer your questions, to create the scene a little better, and you just start bawling, and you're carrying a lot of other people's trauma and violence with you. And I think conferences like this are a really great space where we can get together and talk about, that's one of the most challenging aspects of this method, I think, is sitting in that sometimes, which I think is very hard. I have a couple of different methods. One is coming more from Gloria Anzaldua, where I do like to gravitate to an image. Typically, I like to start off my work with an image, whether I'm creating the image or the image comes to me in my everyday life. One of the things that Amira de la Garza talks about in her 4 seasons of method is that you are always in the research process. And there's these examples, and some of the people who have published on this work is, I went to the museum and I was there all day, but the insight of what I just saw came from the bus ride leaving the museum. So just because you're not in the actual space doesn't mean that you aren't still researching, or your subconscious or unconscious isn't still sort of acting as a magnet to bring you what you need to put the thing together. So I think starting from a space of where you're looking at an image, maybe sometimes folks like to think of it like a symbol, and then from there you move out. I tend to be someone who likes to do I call it throwing up on the page, and just sort of put it all out there, because I find editing much easier than the writing side of the process. So I usually spend 50-50 on both. So I'm writing and then spitting it all out there, and then it's through the editing process where I can start to layer things, where I can bring back images that I had from other earlier parts of the essay, or maybe from, in this case, different parts of the book. bring them back in. Some of my work, it'll open up with a poem, and then the actual essay is actually just a reflection of the poem. If you really read the essay, it's pulling on the same imagery of the poem, and it's unfolding the knowledge in the same linear path as the poem is. Although I do think the poem is very circular, but it's following it. It's a reflection of it. And so I do a lot of that type of work. It's image making. And I will also say, and I'm sure a lot of people in the room already know this as well, one of the reasons I like to do the sort of throw up on the page method is because it is really hard sometimes, I think, to tap back in to whatever emotion that you were feeling when you were originally writing it. And in the case of Pulse Orlando, I mean, you know, you're throwing up on the page to get it all out, because it's going to be very challenging to go back into that feeling willingly, consciously. And so for me, that's also part of the method. Is I can, once I shift to editing mode, I can sort of be in like a far away kind of space, and I can move it and play with it in a way in which I don't feel so emotionally attached to it. So that's also why I'm kind of like, oh, let me get this all out. And then I can kind of back off a little bit. And I'll also say in my writing, I have that same sort of approach. It's very like, sort of kind of bringing it right to your face, but then backing off. And sometimes the backing off is with, that's the backing off for me is when I start to plug in the quotations and the paraphrase citations, because I find that energy that comes from the training we received has a great way of, or at least for the reader, to be like, let them have that breath. Okay, now I'm gonna go back into it. The embodied, visceral feeling of the narrative that I'm telling. And then, okay, let me quote some John Warren to frame this, or let me bring in some Rona Halualani. Okay, let's bring it away, and now let's go back into it. So there's an ebb and flow, I think, to my writing process as well. I'm always very interested in what the reader is experiencing. And so I often will also, as part of my process, give my writings to, lay folks. So I'll give it to my mom, or I'll give it to my brother. And if they can see, when they give me the feedback, if they can say like, oh, I love all the poetic stuff, I really love all the narrative, but I'm having a little trouble with the citations. I'm having a little trouble with the big theory. But then if I bring it to, to Rona, and she might say something along the lines of, I love all the citations, I love all the theory. Sometimes, I'm challenged by the narrative, I'm challenged by the poetic. If I can have both sides of the coin hitting that, then I know I've hit the right mark. And with this book in particular, that's why, again, I have this sort of like, is this a poetry book or is this an academic book? Because it has a really nice balance to it. And it's in that sort of, again, that flow, that circular back and forth flow. And I get really excited whenever people give me feedback, and the things that they're pulling from the book are maybe not things I had explicitly wanted, but are so valuable. And it just makes me so grateful that this is the method that I use for this particular book, and really all my writing.
I love that, Rob. The articulation of your process, of your autoethnographic practice is so helpful. I love to hear all of that. So thank you for that. Tony, did you want to ask another question, or we got it? Cool.
I was just clapping.
Yeah. Wonderful. Ricardo, and then Briar. We'll go back to you after that. Well, I think you're muted, Ricardo. There we go.
Right. Hello, thank you, Dr. Roderick. I have a question. What was the specific moment of your life that inspired you to explore the communication studies of the Jotería? It was like you read a cuento, or you listened a chismé, or what was the moment that you have a click and you say, oh, okay, I would like to write something about that. Of course, if you want to share with us.
Yeah, no, definitely. I can think of sort of 3 separate moments that have been instrumental to my path reaching this moment. I think one is, early on in my career, I was just very aware of the ways in which I was being tokenized. And I made a very purposeful, conscious choice to lean into that tokenization It allowed me to have a lot of publications as an MA and a PhD student. So I was set up for success when I went out there. Now I'm a little tired. Now I'm like, no, I want to write another book. I'm really interested in astrology and tarot right now. I think from a communication studies perspective that values social constructionism, it's just, there's so much there that I find so incredibly fascinating. It's definitely in line with my trajectory I've already had in comm studies, where I invest a lot of time and energy in spirituality as a way to break up the mind-body split. And because right now I'm a little tired. I'm tired of writing about LGBTQ Latinos, if I'm being honest. It'll probably always be something I'm writing about, but right now I'm like, I don't want like an assignment to write this, you know. But to get to your point, to your question, the first moment for me, I was an undergraduate at San Jose State. One of my other first professors' name was Dr. Wen-Shu Lee. She was really instrumental at that critical turn to the field in the early 2000s, late 1990s. And I remember she took me to Japantown for dinner. And I think now is like, I'm a professor, I'm at an institution where I only have undergraduates. I would never take an undergraduate to dinner. I'm just too nervous now. But she did that for me. And I think without that dinner, I wouldn't be here. I had always been told I was a smart person, but no one ever pulled me to the side and be like, hey, you know, I see that you're really good at this, and I can see you doing this. Have you thought about that? And I'll support you to get you there. I've never had that. And so she was the first person who did that for me. And so once I got into the MA program, you know, Rona was on my committee, and I just really felt like I flourished in that department. I always loved it as an undergraduate, and then as a graduate student, I just got so much out of it. And I know I did because I would go take classes in other parts of the university, or later on in my career, I'd go to, you know, the big workshop at Northwestern or whatever, and I would know terminology and critical theory that none of these other people knew. I remember specifically someone was like, what's an interlocutor? And in my head, I'm like, I know what an interlocutor is. And so I just know that I had such great training at San Jose State. Like, I still rely on that training. I still have all those syllabi, Rona, by the way, and I look through them sometimes. And so that moment with Dr. Wen-Shu Lee was really big for me to get here. The other one was, you know, meeting and being able to work with Dr. Bernadette Calafell. I loved going to San Jose State. It's such a beautiful school. It really is one of those places where, as an undergraduate, you could be sitting next to anybody around the world. It really was like that. And I just really valued that. But I never actually had a professor who was LGBTQ and Latino. And so to have that experience of working with somebody who, quote unquote, got it. And a lot of her work, it does similar things that I do, which is translational, but also kind of putting all the knowledge that she's built from her own work in one place, so that I, as a student, I, as a scholar, don't have to run all over the place like she had to. So having her in my corner was a really big part of why I chose to do this book, because I had the support. I have the support from somebody who would say, go read that and go read that, as opposed to someone who is going to say, hey, let me reach out to a colleague, which, by the way, that's very valuable too. I don't want to downplay any of that work because I get those emails, but to have someone who just was in the know, who was invested in continuing her academic lineage with me was really, really big. And then I think last but not least is just the life experience of moving through an incredibly white discipline, and, you know, an incredibly challenging place in the world to live if you're a person of color, and having questions about my experiences. You know, going into a classroom and wondering, why am I the only brown person here? Why am I the only LGBTQ person here? It might have been in Rona's class. I say this to my own classes now. So it might have been for me, Rona, but I always tell my students, you know, who's here, who's not here, and why? And why? And so those questions just, like, I don't want to say haunted me, but they haunted me. And I had to put in time and energy to try and find those answers for myself. It really felt like my calling. If I die tomorrow, I think this book is absolutely part of why I was put to this planet, and I'm very proud of it. So that's also part of it, just the experiences, and just having so many questions about, but why is this happening to me, and not wanting to get into a victim mode about it, wanting to be active in my own agency and my resistance to this thing that kept telling me that wasn't enough, that I wasn't worthy, that the knowledge that I wanted to create and bring to the table isn't knowledge. And I'm very forceful as I push back on that. Even now in my career, I'm not into those conversations anymore. So I hope that I got at your question, but it was really women of color and a lot of just support that got me here.
That's wonderful, Rob. We, as a professor at San Jose State, dating myself, we saw Dr. Gutierrez-Perez as an undergrad asking questions and not being satisfied with we were like, yeah, this is, and really pushing on the questions. And I saw that. Dr. Bernadette Calthal, I should also say, is a wonderful, wonderful autoethnographer. And is at Gonzaga University Critical Racial Ethnic Studies. And if you have a chance to see her work, it is really transformative. And I consider her to be a giant in terms of her critical work. So, Briar, we're going to go to you now. Oh, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, sorry, no, I'm so immersed in this conversation. First of all, I just want to say that I'm late to academic work, and I also have a trans child, so I'm super blessed to be on the edge of this community. And my understanding of this community is that it's inherently political. Just being alive is inherently political. And so as I consider my next steps in academia, I'm also really fascinated, and I think you've already answered this question, so please, I'm sorry if it sounds disingenuous, but I'm really interested in the interface between the stuff that happens in an academic silo and the rest of life. And so I heard you talk about, like, you've gone out and you've talked to these 5 people and you've written this book, and it's huge. I think sounds, I can tell it's groundbreaking and that I'm going to read it. I'm interested in the interface and the effect maybe on your own life or your community, or how that works or how it has worked.
Yeah, no, thank you. I appreciate that. In general, I tend to be a person who likes my privacy. I have a very outgoing personality. I would consider myself an extrovert. However, when it comes to academia, I really think it's important for me not to lose my roots in my poor and working class background. So I put a lot of time and energy into that. So for example, I am going to come to this in a baseball hat and a sweatshirt. This is what we wear in everyday life, and so this is what I'm going to wear. And so it's even now in my new institution, I really I should actually back up. I've been working since I was 14 to take care of myself and to have food for lunch. And so I have been working for a very, very long time. And so I have a very strong work ethic and code. And so I definitely have a very healthy separation between work and my real life. And if anything, I have really great examples. I think Dr. Halualani really showed me like how you can make this happen. You could be an all-star and you can be brilliant, and then you go home and you're having that quality time with your kids, and you're having quality time with your husband, and you have a really healthy. I don't know, Rona. I just always thought you had a very healthy work-life balance, and I just always modeled my own academic trajectory on that balance. And so that's part of what I purposefully do. Is I have family that are in and out of jail. I have family that are homeless right now. I am in California in one of the most expensive places to live with a little food insecurity. So I'm going to connect with the people who also have the food insecurity. And so I think it's very purposeful. To answer your question, it's very purposeful. I like to keep one foot in the world of the everyday and then one foot in the world of the academic. And I think the book reflects that, I think, a little bit too. I think that gets at your question.
Yeah, it does.
Okay,
Wonderful.
perfect.
Thank you. And for our last question, because I know that we need to end very shortly because this ends at 9:50. But Juan, I wanted to make sure you had a chance to ask Dr. Gutierrez-Perez our very final question. I apologize.
Wonderful.
I wish we could stay here forever.
Wonderful. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
this is my first time in this symposium. So Robert, we missed you at HAS this year.
I know, I missed you guys.
Okay, so my question is basically about language as being political, because to me, language and location go by in hand. And I wanted to ask you a question from a Latino who is not the stereotypical, Mexican American, but from Panama. And my question is pretty brief. How do you navigate this idea of using the term Latino, which to me sometimes is very colonizing, to do social justice for all of us who do not fall within the category of Mexican or Mexican American? The reason why I'm asking you these questions, because some of the terms that you use, like plática, chismé, pan dulce, joto, within the Panamanian context, those terms do not apply the same as they do apply within the U.S. soil. So that's my question. How would you do social justice for all of us who do not qualify under the umbrella of a Latino or whose ancestry comes from Mexico?
Yeah, no, thank you for that question. So a couple of things. I consider myself Chicano. That's my preferred term. I found a lot of empowerment through that term. It's one of the few identity terms that allow me to be all of myself in one word. And so I consider myself Chicano. I actually am not a big fan of the Latino term for the same reasons you sort of outlined already, Juan, in that like it's a very sort of depoliticized way of connecting a community across time and space. And yet, if we look at policy, I mean, how effective has this identity term been towards organizing? I don't think it is. So just in general, that's sort of where I tend to stand. In terms of navigating, all these different terms, I think there's a big part of my book where I talk about language and the way in which language is imbued with power, history, and politics. And I use the example of, Chicano, Latino, et cetera, as a way to talk through the power of language in this moment. So in the book, I'm talking about how many times folks use difference as a way to create and maintain their own identities. And so, a term like Latino, I think is fascinating because there's a lot of ways into that for me. There really are. I am half Mexican. And yet there's always a point where it doesn't quite fit anymore. And so here I am in terms of navigating this term but I'm not 100% Latino. I am Black and African American. I am white, specifically English and Dutch. And so for me, there's always a limit to some of these terms. So when I'm hanging out with my Black or African American friends, there always hits a moment where like, but your hair isn't kinky enough, so you don't get this. You don't get this joke, or you didn't have this experience with me because you're often the darkest in the room, but you're not as dark as me. In my white circles, similar, I'm never identified as a white person. Typically, that's the Latino one of the group. And so there's all these sort of lines in the sand when it comes to holding multiple identities and being mixed race as I am. And so I find it to be very, very challenging. Again, I think I mentioned before, there's a lot of clashing between these, where in one world it makes sense, but then in the other world it doesn't make sense. And I have to sort of navigate and make sense of that in real time sometimes. And so I find it incredibly challenging. And I think the last thing I'll say, because I know we're running out of time here, is at least with this book and with my own work, I'm not trying to speak for everybody. I'm really not trying to speak for everybody. I'm trying to articulate a mode of resistance and agency that folks utilize to create livable spaces for themselves, where they sometimes can thrive, but mainly survive. And so I have a very complicated relationship with that term as well. It's not something that really encapsulates a lot of my being, but I find it useful when talking through ideas around language and power and agency and resistance, because it is one of these ways in which people can kind of get into the woods, but then they have to find their own way out.
Wonderful. Got Dr. Gutierrez-Perez. I want to thank all of you.
Can I make a quick plug? Can I make a quick plug too? And especially folks in this room, if any of y'all would love to do any book reviews of this book, it's brilliant. Send them to the Journal of Autoethnography. We would welcome multiple reviews, so don't feel like, oh my gosh, am I the first? So I'm just saying, if you're interested, pick it up, write a review, send it to us.
Love that.
Love
Love
that.
that.
I need to get my tenure.
Oh, easy, easy. I want to thank you all. I want to thank Tony and Keith for inviting us. Dr. Gutierrez-Perez, your book is really like a North Star, not just to the community that I know that you're speaking to, but somebody like me as well, who has always worked to see herself in a very different discipline and world. And so I thank you all for being here. I hope you enjoy the other sessions. Rob, I'll reach out. Keith, I'll reach out.
Yes,
Much love to all of you. Mahalo and aloha.